Tonight, peace talks between Russia and Ukraine break down as Russian troops advance and cities suffer from shortages of food, medicine, and heat. The death toll grows in towns like Mariupol, forcing the port city to bury citizens in a mass grave. But the Ukrainian resistance fights back, taking out Russian tanks and defusing missiles. Our reporting tonight from the southern part of the country, where those who chose to stay behind are taking extraordinary measures to stop the invasion. Putin's endgame. What we're learning tonight after the U.S. estimates Russia has lost up to 6,000 soldiers in the first 2 weeks of war. Raising the rent as inflation hits a new 40-year high. Families face homelessness as landlords up their monthly payments. Winter weather threat. The severe storm bringing snow, rain, and cold temperatures to nearly 60 million Americans. Eye on America, the new 911, how police departments are arming their officers to handle mental health calls. Masks on. TSA extends the travel mandate for airline passengers. And how this teenager represents a sign of the times.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jerika Duncan in for Norah. Tonight, Russian forces are maintaining their pressure on the city of Mariupol 1 day after the bombing of a maternity hospital that sparked outrage around the world. Officials say at least 3 people were killed in that attack, including a young girl. Russian forces continue their advance on the capital of Kyiv, but here you can see Ukraine's military is fighting back, appearing to open fire on a column of Russian tanks. U.S. officials warn that Russian forces are operating with a, quote, reckless disregard for civilians as they continue their constant bombardment of residential neighborhoods. 2 weeks of shelling has left large sections of the country in ruins, and thousands of residents now stranded without food, medicine, heat, and electricity. More than 2.3 million refugees have escaped to neighboring countries, many to Poland, where some of them today met with Vice President Kamala Harris. But we begin tonight with CBS's Charlie DAKOTA reporting once again from Kyiv. Charlie, good evening.
Good evening to you, Jerika. The Russian government again declared a ceasefire and a humanitarian corridor starting tomorrow in 5 cities, including here in the capital and the besieged city of Mariupol. But tonight, the Deputy Prime Minister said not a single civilian was able to leave that city today. A day after the airstrike that ripped through the maternity hospital in Mariupol. No mercy in the response from Russia's foreign minister. It's not the first time we've heard pathetic shrieks about so-called atrocities committed by Russia's armed forces, he said. Sergei Lavrov insisted the hospital was a legitimate target, being used as a base by radical militants. He was in Turkey meeting with Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Kuleba for the highest level talks since the invasion began. But any hope of a breakthrough lay buried beneath the rubble. City council officials say a child is among the dead at the hospital, adding to more than 70 children killed and countless more injured across Ukraine. On a visit to neighboring Poland, Vice President Kamala Harris joined calls for Russia to be held accountable.
There should be an investigation, and we should all be watching.
She also sought to reinforce U.S. ties with NATO amid a disagreement after a Polish proposal to provide Ukraine with old Soviet-era fighter jets. Russian troops continue to advance towards the capital itself. Northeast of Kyiv, drone video alleges to show a column of Russian tanks coming under fire and turning back. Despite heavy losses, militarily, Russia still has the upper hand. Today, Ukraine's information minister asked America and its allies to close down the airspace once again so Ukrainians could fight on the ground.
On each road, on each street, there are ordinary people who are going to fight for all the streets, for all these roads, because it's their homes. That's the most important message. We not give up.
Unable to break Ukraine's defenses, Russia seems intent on breaking Ukraine's spirit. What's not yet known is just how far they'll go. Russian forces are slowly closing in on the capital here, now within just a few miles. Tonight, the mayor said half the city has already fled. As we've seen for ourselves, the rest are either taking up fighting positions or taking shelter and hoping for the best. Jerika?
Charlie DAKOTA, thank you. Tonight, President Zelenskyy says authorities evacuated almost 40,000 people today from a number of cities as the humanitarian crisis worsens. Russian forces are making inroads across the entire Black Sea coastline, where the residents who remain face the choice of flee or stay and fight. CBS's Chris Livesay reports from Odessa, a city on edge.
The shelling is ceaseless, despite the ceasefire. Russian forces firing yet again on humanitarian corridors meant for thousands to flee from the city of Mariupol. Instead, those spared are forced to bury the rest, some in mass graves. We have no gas. We're freezing, says Tatiana Nikolenko. Bodies are being buried in the yards of the apartment blocks. We can't live like this. With no more running water, desperate locals turn to an old well. Local officials say more than 1,200 people have been killed in this city alone. And the devastation is by design. One by one, Russia is targeting Ukraine's coastal strongholds. Kherson was the first city to fall into Russian hands, though not without resistance. Today, it's attacking cities like Mykolaiv as it makes its way west towards the crown jewel of the Black Sea, Odessa. Lose it, and Ukraine loses its last port and vital supply lines. Vladimir Putin called it out by name in his declaration of war. It's been bracing for a fight ever since. Men and women fill more than 10,000 sandbags a day, all volunteers like air traffic controller Dmitro Boris.
How much are you willing to sacrifice?
I can sacrifice anything, even my life, just to save the people behind me.
Even your life?
Even my life. That's no matter right now.
If Odessa falls, Vladimir Putin would dominate the northern half of the Black Sea, putting pressure on NATO allies Romania and Bulgaria as well. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says an attack here is imminent. Jerika?
Chris Livesay reporting from Odessa tonight. Thank you. New U.S. military intelligence is giving the world a detailed look at the state of the war. The first 2 weeks of Putin's invasion have not gone according to plan for Russia, but it still has a great deal of weapons and force it can unleash. For more on that, here's CBS's David Martin at the Pentagon.
In many places, the Russians have not just bogged down, they've been stopped in their tracks. A U.S. official says hundreds of armored vehicles have been destroyed, and each one contains Russian soldiers. His estimate of the number of Russian dead, 5,000 to 6,000 killed in action, and 3 times that many wounded. As our partners at the BBC found, Ukrainian soldiers are not intimidated by the Russian legions.
They have a lot of people, have a lot of tanks, a lot of their vehicles and techniques, but we fight in our land and we protect our families, so it doesn't matter how they fight. We fight like lions and they won't win.
The Russians are making good targets by sticking to the roads, in some cases just running out of gas and sitting there. Ukrainians are making good use of the thousands of anti-tank weapons shipped into the country. The head of the Defense Intelligence Agency told Congress he had underestimated the Ukrainians.
I question their will to fight. That was a bad assessment on my part, because they have fought bravely and honorably and are doing the right thing.
The Russians have also lost an estimated 15 to 20 aircraft and 20 to 25 helicopters, most of them hit by missiles fired from the ground. They are trying to make up for it by doubling down on firepower, much of it indiscriminate.
It is a combination of mostly missiles, artillery, multiple rocket launchers.
Despite their losses, the Russians continue to creep closer to the capital of Kyiv, less than 10 miles from the city center in the west and 25 miles in the east. A U.S. official says they could encircle the capital within 1 to 2 weeks.
That estimate of 5,000 to 6,000 dead, if it's correct, means that Russia has lost more soldiers in 2 weeks than the U.S. lost in the entire Iraq war. The estimate for Ukrainian military losses is between 2,000 and 4,000 killed in action. Jerika?
David Martin really putting things in perspective with those numbers. Thank you. There is some bad news to report on the U.S. economy. Consumer inflation jumped 7.9% over the past year. That's a near 40-year high. Gas prices are up 38% year to year, not including the most recent spikes. And
Disney Cruise Line activities and National Geographic magazine and tours. Their employees in the country now facing uncertainty. McDonald's and PepsiCo each employ over 60,000. IKEA's 15,000 workers in both Belarus and Russia also impacted.
This is the biggest mall in St. Petersburg and the most famous one.
Stores shuttered as sanctions bite. At other locations, long lines of customers try to get in one last purchase. It's sad that so many world brands are suspending their work in Russia, and it's too bad that so many people will be out of their jobs. And tonight, Russia's financial crisis is being felt outside its borders. Russians trying to use their credit cards abroad have also reported problems because of sanctions and bans.
And how do people feel here, David? Well, it's so hard to say because more and more people here really just have been trying to get on with their lives. But you do feel a shift. Fewer people in cafes and restaurants. We've heard of more people trying to leave the country. I would say there is a creeping realization that 30 years of progress may be about to end. David?
James Longman in Moscow again tonight. James, thank you. And tonight, the staggering new number here, now 2.3 million Ukrainian refugees. And tonight, the urgent effort to evacuate the most vulnerable, children with cancer, other patients, our team witnessing what's called the Train of Hope. ABC's Matt Gutman in Lviv, Ukraine.
Tonight, in a country where even hospitals are no longer safe, a special train bearing those whose lives rely on constant medical care. Children with disabilities, some of them with cancer. Medics tenderly transferring them from buses to a medical train equipped with intensive care units. The kids clutching their teddy bears, tended to by a brigade of mothers and nurses evacuated from hospitals across Ukraine. Our Marcus Moore was there on the Poland border.
You can see behind me here the beds, the children with their families, and the team of medics here helping them as they get ready to set off on this journey. It will be at least a 7-hour journey to the north of Poland.
Here in Ukraine, near the front lines, there are more daring rescues.
So behind us is Ukraine, and out in front of us is Russia.
Recently retired Special Forces operator Jeremy Locke and his team rescuing these 6 kids east of Kyiv.
Picking them up, getting them to safety.
Their NGO, Aerial Recovery, bringing an additional 200 other children here to Lviv, where it's safe. Traveling on similar back roads this week, the Novikovs. 13-year-old Dasha snapping pictures of the journey. Tired mom Oksana cradling their cat. Dad Kirill walking the dog. They fled the hard-hit city of Kharkiv. We met them at this gym turned into a shelter. For the family, it was clear when it was time to leave. The explosions at the plant blew the doors off your house? Would you stay here? Would you go to Poland? A mother's brave face recedes into vulnerability. Then tears. Her son runs over to her, whispering love. For now, they're still together. David, that train of hope at the station in Poland showed how complex it can be to rescue those with disabilities. And now advocates are sounding the alarm about the 2.7 million Ukrainians with disabilities who can't go down the stairs to the bomb shelter, who can't walk to the train station to escape those frontline cities. David.
It's unbelievable. Matt Gutman, our thanks to you and to Marcus Moore tonight. This evening, Vice President Kamala Harris and that diplomatic mission to Poland, the Vice President offering very tough words on Putin's actions so far in Ukraine, the human toll, as some leaders in the West now label what Putin has done as war crimes. So let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, tonight. And Mary, Vice President Harris in Poland accusing the Russian government of committing atrocities was the word that she used in Ukraine.
David, the vice president is now embracing calls for an international investigation into Putin's possible war crimes. Kamala Harris today saying we are witnessing atrocities of unimaginable proportions, including the targeting of that maternity and children's hospital, pregnant women injured being carried out on stretchers. Harris calling this violence unprovoked and unjustified. Attacks on civilians like this constitute war crimes. But when pressed today, the White House notes there's an ongoing formal legal process that has to take place before anything can be officially labeled a war crime. And David, while this would lay the groundwork for accountability, offer some sliver of hope for future justice, even if Vladimir Putin is labeled a war criminal, it is unlikely he would ever face trial. David.
Mary Bruce live at the White House. Thank you, Mary. And the economy and the prices you pay. New numbers on inflation tonight, the worst since 1982. Consumer prices up 7.9% over the past year. Energy prices up more than 25%. Chief Business and Economics correspondent Rebecca Jarvis
is pretty breezy, and that's going to be the trend the next couple of days as well. Wind chills for the time being are above zero, but it already feels like 9 degrees in Brookings, and we're going to start to see wind chills falling below zero later on tonight. And even in some cases, air temperatures will be falling below zero as well. That'll mainly be in northeastern South Dakota. A cold Friday on the way, noon hour. Some of us only in the single digits, a few places barely in the low to mid-teens. But then as we head into Saturday, the rebounding temperatures will be on the way. We just have to get through a little bit of a colder start to the day first, but then heading into Saturday afternoon, the 30s are back, 40s and 50s further off to the west, and we'll see more 50s building in on Sunday afternoon. Staying breezy.
We spoke with mom and spoke with kiddo, and we don't have any concerns for safety at this time.
Resolved without a siren or a gun in sight. For Eye on America, Jeff Begay's CBS News, Aurora, Colorado.
Still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, Americans will have to wear masks on planes, trains, and buses a little longer. A new ruling from
thousands of stingers.
Weapons like stingers have moved in, and they have been used with effect, and I think the Ukrainians will continue to be able to use those in small unit tactics with great effect.
And the West has sent Javelins, an anti-tank guided missile system, shoulder-fired, with a range of over 8,000 feet.
It fires a weapon that goes up into the air and then comes back down, really hitting a tank or a vehicle from above. It does so because it's got less armor on the top generally and is more vulnerable.
The Ukrainian military has put out several videos showing its lethal dexterity in using these Western-made weapons against the Russians. This video shows a destroyed Russian tank on fire. There's aerial footage of a Russian tank column getting slammed with missiles. Javelins and Stingers, crucial to the Ukrainians, analysts say, partly because they're so-called fire-and-forget weapons.
Fire and forget, so you can fire it, and then the person who fires it can scoot.
The Russians, experts say, have their own very effective weapons in Ukraine. Iskander and Caliber missiles and light mobile T-72 tanks. But they're also accused of using cluster bombs and preparing to use so-called vacuum or thermobaric bombs that are not supposed to be used in civilian areas.
Thermobarics are horrible. They explode, and then they have a secondary explosion that sucks the air out of the immediate proximity.
Analysts say the Ukrainian success with their shoulder-fired missiles is being aided by sometimes sloppy Russian tactics.
They are lining their tanks and their armored personnel carriers, you know, nose to fanny, going down the street. And there's no security, flank security, to the left or the right. And so they become sitting ducks.
As effective as these weapons are, CNN is told that U.S. officials have not given the Ukrainians the newest versions of weapons like Stinger missiles out of concern that somehow on the battlefield some of them might fall into the hands of the Russians, who then might steal that technology, Wolf.
That's an important point as well. Brian Todd reporting. Thank you very, very much. Let's dig deeper right now. Retired Admiral James Stavridis, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, is joining us. He's also the co-author of the book 2034, there's the cover, a novel of the next World War. It's out in paperback right now. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. Are these the best possible weapons the U.S. can provide the Ukrainians right now, or are there other more sophisticated weapons that you think the U.S. could offer?
I think there's more to come for the Russians from our side, to include higher altitude. You heard correctly that the Stinger goes up to about 10,000, 11,000 feet. That won't get after the Russian jets that are operating at a higher level. So we've got better missiles we can offer our Ukrainian friends that will get up into that zone. And then ultimately, Wolf, although we're kind of going through a little bit of logistic challenge, I would call it, with getting these Polish fighters, these MiG-29s, into the hands of Ukrainians, I think that would get up into the top of the air stack, would become a real asset. For example, going after that big convoy that's stalled north of Kiev. What a target. A MiG-29 or two could make light work of that. We've got more to send Vladimir Putin's way, and we should.
Yeah, well, that hasn't happened yet. Why is the U.S. comfortable, Admiral, providing some weapons to the Ukrainians, but fears others, like fighter jets, for example, could actually trigger an escalation with Russia? What's the difference?
Well, it's all a matter of degree, Wolf. And so if you think of it as a spectrum that kind of runs from, hey, we just sit back and watch, to the other end of the spectrum with the 18th Airborne Corps goes into Ukraine and cleans up the Russians, which, believe me, they could. You need to find a balance only because Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. So the debate right now is, how far do you go? How much risk do you take? Personally, I think the administration has done generally a good job of finding that middle point, getting javelins, as you just heard, getting Stingers into the fight. Now is time, in my view, to take a bit more risk, more higher altitude missile systems, continue to work the problem of getting the jets into the fight. All of this means we are going to be helping the Ukrainians push back on the Russians on this illegal, war criminal invasion.
The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, says a no-fly zone would not necessarily offer Ukraine significant protection against many of the weapons that the Russian forces are already using right now. Do you share that assessment?
I do. I know Avril Haines extremely well. She's one of our very sharpest minds focused on this. And here's the point. What she is saying correctly is that we can put a lot of tools in the hands of the Ukrainians to let them build a Ukrainian no-fly zone over their own country. It has been quite heartening to watch the Ukrainians do so, even with relatively low-level weapons like Stingers. My view, let's give them a little bit more. Let's continue to ratchet up the pressure on Vladimir Putin.
The White House is warning that Russia could potentially use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, but they're refusing to draw any red lines or offer any specifics about a U.S. response. What do you think? What kind of response would a chemical or biological attack by the Russians against Ukraine, what kind of a response would that warrant from the U.S.?
Well, let's begin with the probability or not of a chemical or biological attack. I think it's unlikely Russia is going to pull that particular dirty trick out, because what they're trying to do here is put that back onto the Ukrainians, onto the United States. I think that's more about their attempt to control the narrative than a serious attempt to use that against our forces.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to stay in touch with you. Appreciate it very much.
You bet.
Just ahead, a young Ukrainian woman describes the terror of being attacked by Russia and her gut-wrenching decision to flee her home and the fighting.
The 18-year-old rarely saw anyone who looked like her in sign language books, so she created her own.
Had you ever written a book before?
Oh no, this is my first experience trying to be published. It's just crucial. It's essential that black and brown individuals, feel represented in life. It kind of, makes you feel bad when you don't see yourself.
Using pictures of those closest to her, she's published Signing with Kai.
I'm extremely proud of her.
Kayana's mother, Kadijah, says her daughter is proving she can accomplish anything.
It seems like She never lets somebody say, you can't do this.
If they say that, that makes her go even harder.
Kayana plans to publish even more books. She wants to bridge the gap between the deaf and hearing communities.
The letter I.
I? Like this?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I'm here as living proof to show people I can teach others. I can learn and I can be an educator.
She can also be an inspiration. Michael George, CBS News, Detroit.
An inspiration indeed. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Mike and Sarah. We
Smart and savvy. When it comes to saving money, the Marshalls are...
Can't resist this. The Republic...
And the pros and cons of annuities. Call now for this free book.
Now, they're totally...
get their hands on. But the problem is something like this is so tangible and real in the lives of the American people that they have felt it for so long. It doesn't matter what any politician says. The public feels the truth because they live the truth. So I totally dismiss it. It was a big mistake for Jen to use that same word, transitory, as you picked up. You know, one lesson from the podium is if you said something once that was a special word, had an impact like transitory, and it flopped, it failed, don't repeat it.
Yeah. Speaking of the truth, we're trying to get to the truth of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. You heard from Senator Warner from Senate Intel that he believes Russia is losing. The Director of National Intelligence today in a hearing said this about the Russian troops.
We assess Moscow underestimated the strength of Ukraine's resistance and the degree of internal military challenges we are observing in the Russian military, which include an ill-constructed plan, morale issues, and considerable logistical challenges.
The challenge now, Kimberly, is to get Putin to an off-ramp. How does this stop without increasing what we have to put into Ukraine?
Yeah, and that's what these negotiations have been, but that's why these negotiations are a bit depressing, right? Because what Putin is demanding, which is essentially to take ground and have a puppet government, is exactly what Zelenskyy says he's never going to do. And I think the real risk and fear and why you now hear people talking about the worry, for instance, of chemical weapons, is that if Putin doesn't have that off-ramp, the other option is desperation and to double down on a lot of these strategies and tactics that led to the bombing of that maternity ward. And so that, I mean, we can celebrate to one degree the fact that Russia is losing, but there are also real risks out of that as well, too.
Right. Meantime, Vice President Harris traveled to Poland today. Take a listen.
The United States and Poland are united in what we have done and are prepared to do to help Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. Full stop.
Why is she there? Why did you send the Vice President of the United States to Poland without an announcement, without something that she's going to say that we're going to do, without any action? We don't need photo ops.
Mara, this is obviously in the midst of this MiG-29 back and forth, whether Poland wants to, well, Poland definitely wanted to, but the U.S. says not. But why not send Vice President Harris with a deliverable?
Well, the deliverable, because the U.S. has been split about what the deliverable should be. Some people think we should allow Poland to give the U.S. its MiG-29s, fighter jets that presumably Ukrainian pilots know how to fly, and then the U.S. would somehow transfer them. But there are a lot of people, and you've interviewed them, who thinks that is an escalatory move, and that Ukraine would do just as well with tons and tons more anti-aircraft weapons, which they've been using very well, although the Ukrainian president is asking for planes. So the U.S. is split. Poland doesn't want to be responsible for handing over the MiGs to Ukraine. Poland's in an extremely vulnerable position, but the U.S. thinks it's a bad idea.
Having covered the Pentagon before, there's always nuance here. The Poles, those planes are old. Yep. They wanted new F-16s from the U.S. as well.
All we know is overhead door. When you see somebody that's got the ribbon on the door, you know that they got the best. It's a good...
The clarity you need.
Tonight, a bit of good news before we sign off. Reunited, and it feels so good. Look at this, warm reunion caught on camera at the Polish border. A young girl hugging her father, calling him Papa, while gently tapping her head against his. Reunited there, refugees from Ukraine. Meantime, St. Mary's Ukrainian.
What I owe limitless amount.
Don't be embarrassed about it.
Around 20 later on tonight. A colder day tomorrow, but then a warm-up begins this weekend. Details coming up in a few minutes. This is Dakota News Now.
Arby's corned beef Reuben. Arby's corned beef. Arby's. Come on! Arby's, we have the meats.
The First Alert Weather Team helps you plan and prepare for the next big thing.
Actions before and after the deadly crash.
Good evening. South Dakota's Public Safety Secretary's letter to the House Speaker says Ravensburg is, quote, unfit to hold the position of Chief Law Enforcement Officer.
Beaver's cousin spoke with KELO's Perry Groten, saying that he's not surprised by one of the revelations surrounding Ravensburg's texting habits.
Nick Nemec says the most alarming piece of new information in the letter is Craig Price's accusation that Attorney General Jason Ravensburg was exchanging texts about Joe Beaver with someone who appears to be a political consultant who, the letter says, texted 2 days after Beaver's death. Well, at least the guy was a Democrat.
He's shown very little morals throughout this process. And the fact that they would be joking about at least Joe Beaver was a Democrat, so it doesn't matter, doesn't surprise me in the least.
The letter says other...
The sentencing for actor Jesse Smollett over the hate crime attack he staged himself, tracking the powerful bomb cyclone expected to slam the East Coast. Play ball, the deal that just saved Major League Baseball's season, and our exclusive test drive in America's new race to the moon.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. I'm Kristen Welker in tonight for Lester. The war in Ukraine is reaching a barbaric new level as Russian forces are now just 10 miles from Kyiv city center. As the death toll mounts, top diplomats from Russia and Ukraine held urgent talks but failed to reach a breakthrough. And in the wake of that devastating airstrike on a maternity and children's hospital, Ukraine's president saying a Russian bomb killed 3 people, including a 6-year-old child. And now the U.S. ambassador to the UN is accusing Russia of committing war crimes. Vice President Harris is on a high-stakes trip to Poland in the midst of that controversy over whether to send Polish jets to Ukraine. Harris warning the U.S. will defend every inch of NATO. While in Ukraine tonight, the situation has become dire, with many running out of food. Richard Engel starts our coverage from Ukraine.
The direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in Turkey today went nowhere. Ukraine's foreign minister saying Russia is demanding the government's surrender, and his Russian counterpart denied his country even invaded Ukraine, insisting it's merely carrying out a limited military action to defend Russia. He also denied that Russia bombed a maternity hospital yesterday, dismissing what he called pathetic outcries about it, and claiming Ukraine staged the whole thing. Russia appears to be living in an alternative reality now, driven by one man, President Vladimir Putin, who in a televised address declared Russia will overcome sanctions, noting they're causing surging gas prices in the U.S., while Ukrainians continue to put up a tougher than expected fight. We went to see the frontline suburb of Irpin, defending the capital.
The Russians control part of this district. The Ukrainians control other parts, but the front line isn't straight. There are pockets. There are a lot of abandoned cars here, and the soldiers have just been going through, looking for a car with keys in it and some gas, and now it's transport. The streets here are completely empty, and the biggest risk is that you turn a corner, and they're the Russians. A Russian tank, Russian APC.
Irpin is largely deserted, which has created opportunities. Ukrainian soldiers arrest 5 suspected looters with backpacks full of alcohol. The local mayor wouldn't stand for it. As the suspects were taken away in a bread truck, we saw the scale of what Russia is unleashing. Nothing short of collective punishment to try to beat Ukrainians into submission.
Russia continues to insist that it is not targeting civilians, not bombing civilian areas. But just on the outskirts of Kyiv, you can see entire areas have been wiped out, and more strikes are happening right now.
As plumes of smoke rose in the distance, Andre, who has family and business in Texas, handed out thermal scopes and radios, bought with money in part donated by Americans. Meanwhile, we're learning more about the victims of that Russian strike in Irpin Sunday. 3 members of a family killed as they tried to escape the Russian advance. 43-year-old Tatiana Parabanis, her 18-year-old son Nikita, and her 9-year-old daughter Alisa. Tatiana worked for a company based in California.
She loved her family and she was very proud of her kids. She gave them all she could.
Today in Irpin, we met 84-year-old Valentina. With each step, she prayed. Dear Jesus, she whispers, let us live through the day in happiness and destroy Putin and expel him from Ukraine.
And Richard joins us. Richard, the U.S. assessment is Russia could encircle Kyiv in 2 weeks and take the city in 6?
So I think we should all be prepared for a very bloody conflict. It seems that Vladimir Putin is using the exact same strategy that Russia employed in Syria, which is a deliberate, slow, grinding assault on population centers. It could take longer than 6 weeks, so the death toll here could be very high.
Richard Engel reporting tonight from Kyiv. Richard, thank you, and please stay safe. While much of Ukraine is still resisting, in one city, the war has turned into an occupation. Kherson, population 300,000, is a southern port and shipbuilding center. Matt Bradley reports on what it's like with Russian forces in charge.
Kherson, Ukraine offers the first glimpses of Russia's occupation. After 2 weeks, Kherson is the first and only major city to fall to Russian forces. Last week, its residents were proudly protesting against Russian troops. But that's all changed.
Not only they blockade us from food and medicine and basic necessities, but also they are preparing to imprison those who disagree, those who protest.
400 people were arrested yesterday, according to the Ukrainian military. One big difference, local residents tell us, the appearance of the Rosvagardya, Russia's National Guard. This paramilitary force was created in 2016 and answers directly to President Putin. They're mostly deployed in Russia as riot police. Now they're in Kherson, suppressing dissent the same way they do in Russia. In this video of a protest, Russia's version of a police wagon. The National Guard are checking social media, looking around for their apartments, Kherson's mayor said. They're even looking for the people who were fighting against the Russians in 2014. This city is being strangled. The mayor says they have only about a week of food left, and locals accuse the Russians of looting. In this video, soldiers appear to be pushing a shopping cart full of goods from a store. In another video, a person in a military uniform appears to shoot at the door of an electronics store. When it doesn't open, he busts a hole in the glass. The mayor warned that while Kherson is the first city to face occupation, it won't be the last. This war isn't between Russia and Ukraine, he said. That's just one of the steps for Russia. Russia's fighting right now with Europe and the U.S. An occupation that many here say is on the march. Matt Bradley, NBC News, Lviv, Ukraine.
And tonight, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations says Russian attacks on civilians constitute war crimes, while in Poland, Vice President Kamala Harris supported calls for a war crimes investigation. Peter Alexander has more.
Tonight from Vice President Kamala Harris on the ground in Poland, concern and condemnation, denouncing the strike on a Ukrainian maternity hospital.
We have been witnessing for weeks, and certainly just in the last 24 hours, atrocities of unimaginable proportion.
And now one of America's top diplomats becoming the first senior U.S. official to accuse Russia of war crimes.
They constitute war crimes. They are attacks on civilians that cannot be justified by any in any way whatsoever.
Though U.S. policy calls for a thorough international investigation, Harris tonight reinforcing the U.S.'s commitment to its European allies.
The United States is prepared to defend every inch of NATO territory.
The vice president dismissed any disconnect after the U.S. rejected Poland's offer to hand over fighter jets to the U.S. to transfer to Ukraine. But Ukraine's president and top Republicans are demanding the jets be delivered now.
They're better at running their own war. They know what the conditions on the ground are. They're there, we're not.
Top intelligence officials say the U.S. believes Ukraine is not using all of the fighter jets it already has, and that the U.S. is providing what Ukraine needs most, more anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons. Tonight, the White House says it will not draw a red line that would trigger sending American troops to Ukraine if Russia launched a chemical attack, though officials here say the U.S. has not let any Russian attacks go unanswered. Kristen?
Peter, thank you for that report. The vice president also meeting today with Ukrainian refugees. They are the people at the heart of this crisis, with more than 2.3 million taking flight. Kelly Kobiela is in Poland, where more than half of them have gone.
Every day in Poland, the same heartbreaking sight. Thousands of women and children dragging suitcases, carrying backpacks, fleeing war. 16-year-old Diana Prutska escaped Kyiv.
What was it like there? There was not comfortable to stay there because every night we heard. It's okay. It's okay. Very horrible sounds every night.
Poland now hosting 1.4 million refugees from Ukraine. More than 100,000 arrive every day. Teacher Natalia Sodorenko fled with her sister and their children. Her son showing us what he brought from home.
Snacks. Yeah.
Food, his phone, and nothing else.
That's all. That's it.
She told me she's grateful for Poland's help. We didn't expect to be welcomed with open hearts, she says. A real concern after huge anti-migrant protests in Warsaw in 2015. When Poland closed its borders to Syrians fleeing that war. Now, doors and hearts are wide open.
What was this before? Just a meeting room?
That was the office.
CEO Bartosz Svarczek has turned his gaming company offices into a shelter for up to 50 refugees.
I have never seen something like this in Poland. Like, every house is open. Every family is asking, how can we help? What can we do?
People are asking that same question across Eastern Europe, trying to ease the pain and heartbreak of war. Kelly Kobiela, NBC News, Rzeszów, Poland.
Much needed support there. Well, now to those staggering new inflation numbers out today and the squeeze so many Americans are feeling. Consumer prices rose 7.9% over the last year, a new 40-year high. Grocery prices up 8.6%, the biggest yearly increase since 1981. But as bad as inflation has become, it has yet to reach the peak of the 1970s and early 80s. Jolene Kent has more.
After months of struggling with soaring prices and busted budgets, tonight Americans are now facing an even more grim reality. Inflation accelerated 7.9% in February compared to last year, a new 40-year high. Prices are up across the board. Groceries surged 8.6% over last year, rent rising 4.7%, and most of all, gas prices spiking 38%.
When I see these numbers, it's mind-blowing.
Some price jumps are the highest ever recorded, like furniture, lunch meat, baby food, and toys.
We don't want to raise prices, but you see it creeping up on you.
Brian Bao owns the Albany restaurant. It's an 80-year-old institution in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in the mountain region where inflation is the highest in the U.S. at nearly 10%. He says his suppliers are hiking prices.
There's times where they're going to have to add a fuel surcharge. They have to pay to get the product to their warehouse, and then we have to pay again to get it here, and somebody's paying that bill, and it ultimately becomes us or our guest.
In California, Jean Olson works in a grocery store.
You're living in a constant state of panic because I'm always worrying that I've worked enough hours to make the rent.
Today, President Biden responding, saying he's fighting to bring down prices, blaming inflation in large part on what he calls Putin's price hike. But prices surged last month almost entirely before Russia invaded Ukraine, and inflation has been soaring above 5% since last May. Republicans blasting the president.
Gas is over $4 a gallon. And what does Joe Biden say? He said it's all blamed on Russia. Energy prices have been going up dramatically from the day he took office.
The next big question for people here in Wyoming and all across the country is how much will the Federal Reserve raise interest rates next week as it tries to get this inflation under control? Kristen?
Jolene Kent, thank you. Well, as many states and cities end their COVID mask requirements, the federal government.
Second and third at the Denny.
Craig, if you think that's the only thing that's made me feel old today, you would
make. And the Ukrainian military has shown an immense resolve. They've fought hard. That being said, unfortunately, if you look on the overall map, you will see the Russian military slowly but steadily, perhaps fitfully, progressing, trying to complete an encirclement of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, and where they are frustrated, intentionally switching to tactics of barraging urban areas like Kharkiv or maybe Mariupol to try to compel the civilian population to leave, and to try to signal maybe to other cities that they should surrender or capitulate to a Russian encirclement. On the whole, the war where we are now, unfortunately, is very indeterminate. That is, we are much closer to the beginning of it than we are towards the end.
You mentioned some of those major cities that are encircled, including Kharkiv. Does it surprise you how long it is taking for Russians to seize and hold territory? We are hearing, for example, reports from the field that Russian troops in some cases are abandoning their vehicles, that they are using unencrypted comms on the field. Are they disorganized, and how much is that going to affect the overall outlook of this war?
Absolutely. The initial campaign is absolutely shambolic. They had not prepared for a large-scale military operation. In cases like Kharkiv, they actually have not encircled the city. Ukrainians have successfully counterattacked there. They have enveloped cities like Mariupol. They're trying to encircle cities like Mykolaiv. What's really happening on the Russian fight is that it's not been a well-organized effort. They have logistics problems, and as they went into the war, they didn't psychologically or materially prepare their troops. In fact, in all honesty, they lied to them and they pushed them into Ukraine. And that's why we've seen cases of desertion. We've seen a lot of vehicles abandoned. Some of them are due to logistical problems, but some of them are clear-cut case of unit desertion on the battlefield due to low morale. Whereas Ukraine, while outmatched conventionally in terms of qualitative level of equipment, those fighters have strong resolve. They're fighting for something.
That leads me to the question of whether Russia can really achieve its ultimate political objective of controlling Ukraine, especially as we see dead soldiers, wounded Russian soldiers now in the thousands.
That's a great question. So the truth is that given the bad assumptions with which they went into the war, and the operation, which was an attempt at quick regime change, in which they got a bloody nose and had to reconfigure into a large-scale military operation, that you now see them making big adjustments and trying to prosecute. From my point of view, I am very skeptical that they can achieve their political objectives. And don't get me wrong, they can achieve military victories, they can achieve battlefield victories. But I think in many respects, a lot of their assumptions simply had little bearing on reality. Now, they've switched to much more brutal forms of warfare. They are resourcing a military effort, but it's ultimately behind a failed strategy. And I have deep skepticism that they can achieve the political objectives in this war.
So how long do you expect this war to last, Michael?
And I'm afraid my answer is going to be very unsatisfactory. Wars are highly contingent. And I know many people are watching this war, they're living it day by day, or if you're following like me, maybe hour by hour. But the truth is that this war could go on. It could go on for weeks, it could go on for months. I do suspect that at the rate of sort of losses of manpower and material, Russian forces could probably be exhausted within a couple weeks, but the war won't end. Maybe an operational pause to resupply, reorganize. Ceasefires often are ways by which both sides rearm and then continue the conflict in a different phase. I think the first chapter of this war is likely to close in the coming weeks, but this war may be here to stay, may be here with us for quite some time, much longer than we would wish it to be.
Michael Kaufman, Senior Fellow for Russian Studies at the Center for Naval Analyses. Thank you, as always, for joining the NewsHour.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Definitely. Yeah.
Militarily, clearly the U.S. has signaled that they're not going to engage, with U.S. or NATO forces within Ukraine. They've, clearly put a line in the sand that says, they will respond with all power if they were to, attack NATO forces. So, I imagine they feel that they have, some freedom of action within Ukraine. And that's why it's vitally important that we get the Ukrainians as much, equipment that they can use to fight and and defend themselves against these forces for as long as they can.
I'm glad you brought that.
Ultimately, I think we all agree, the Ukrainian military and population is never going to be able to withstand the onslaught of this large Russian military force. So the goal at this point is to make it take as long as possible and make it as painful as possible for the Russians, so that they would, so they'll be deterred from perhaps further adventurism.
Yeah, it's been incredible what they've done. If you'd asked us when the invasion began 2 weeks ago last night, a lot of us said, it could be 24 or 48 hours till they take Kyiv, and still the Ukrainians are holding out. You said it's important to get them everything we possibly can. One of the things that was offered to them was MiG fighter jets from Poland. Originally on Sunday, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said yes. Then all of a sudden the Pentagon changed its mind. Take a listen.
If, for instance, the Polish government, a NATO member, wants to send fighter jets, does that get a green light from the U.S., or are you afraid that that will escalate tension?
No, that gets a green light. In fact, we're talking with our Polish friends right now.
That we don't believe additional aircraft is the most effective answer to meeting those needs in the conflict.
Kirby went on to say that he does believe that sending the aircraft could provoke Vladimir Putin. Does Putin realize effectively that the White House is more scared of him than he is of them?
Well, I'm not sure I would go entirely that far, but clearly between the time Tony Blinken spoke at first and 24 hours later, more rigorous discussion and debate took place within the interagency, at the National Security Council. They tasked the intelligence community to do a kind of a risk-benefit assessment as to whether what the value would be in providing those aircraft versus the risk that it would actually escalate the situation. And it appears from today's testimony on the Hill that the intelligence community fell on the side of that the risk of escalation was greater than the value that would have been obtained by using these aircraft.
Yeah,
and that perhaps they're going to focus now on other weapons that may be more useful in fighting the Russians at this point.
Yeah, we talked about it yesterday. All the things though that they've not gotten with that same logic: Harpoon missiles, encrypted radios, advanced air defense. It's a long list. Larry, we always appreciate you being here. Thanks for double duty yesterday and today.
Hey, not a problem. Have me anytime.
Good to see you. Thank you. Coming up, amid a war and the worst inflation in 40 years, is now really the right time to do a full switch to green energy. Proponent of that tells us his argument, plus why one of the best U.S. missile destroyers won't be ready in case we need it.
Admire President Zelensky's desire to join NATO. And one of, again, the founding principles of NATO is that each country must have the ability, unimpaired, unimpeded, to determine their own future. No other country can tell anyone whether they should or should not join NATO.
The possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, as we know, has been a driving factor of this war. Days after Kamala's trip, Putin invaded Ukraine. Biden decided to send Kamala again, this time to Poland, and the VP had trouble remembering where she was.
I am here, standing here on the northern flank, on the eastern flank, talking about what we have in terms of the eastern flank and our NATO allies.
Then, when she was asked about the fighter jet fiasco between the United States and Poland, she couldn't give an answer.
It's a dynamic situation and requires us to be nimble and to be swift. I mentioned being swift in terms of accountability and consequence. We also fully appreciate we must be swift in terms of providing assistance where we can be helpful.
I wish she could be a little more swift. Kamala did not meet the moment. No swagger, no passion, not even a big announcement or a memorable verbal slap in Vlad's face. When asked about the refugee crisis, she first looked to Poland's president to answer the question, and then she just burst into laughter.
I wanted to know if you think, and if you asked the United States to specifically accept more refugees.
Okay. A friend in need is a friend indeed.
Okay, I can first.
You can't cackle while Russia wages war crimes. Snap out of it. And we're not the only ones saying this. This is a tweet from President Zelensky's former press secretary in response to Kamala's wacky laughter. Quote, "It would be a tragedy if this woman won the presidency." Kamala definitely did some damage on this trip. Putin, as you guys know, is a former KGB guy. He sees a NATO alliance that didn't put its best foot forward today and perceives weakness and division. This performance could have consequences. Ben Shapiro.
Plenity is not a drug. It's made from naturally derived building blocks and helps you feel.
If they're alive, I think it is.
As the best chance for those mild temperatures will be
At pain. Do you think Mariupol can hold, given the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding there?
They're holding, and we are preparing because we are mobilizing our army. And I think that all the world have seen during the last 2 weeks that we resist. And we will fight, we will continue to fight, and we will finish this war with a win. And the Mariupol, of course, it's the most problematic place in this war now. And it's humanitarian catastrophe, that's true. They have as a hostages 350,000 people. No supply of medicine, no supply of water or food, and we have food for several days more. And the hunger can break out in the center of Europe. And I think that all of us have to understand that if the first part of this war, the first week, was the ordinary war, army against army, then when Russia and Putin understood they cannot beat us on the battlefield, they just decided to kill all our children and our parents. And they are just blocking cities and start bombing them. In Mariupol, every 30 minutes, bomb drops on the residential areas. The residential district where I grew up is totally destroyed. And every building around my school, my university, my building where I grew up, all the buildings around it, all of them were hit. And university is destroyed. And it's something, like somebody is killing your past a little bit, but the problem is it's not just your past and your imagination. It's 350,000 people as a hostages, and that is a strategy of Putin. To take these hostages and to behave himself like a state terrorist. And all of us, we have to understand where is our line. Or this line is 350,000 people in Mariupol with hunger. Or maybe this line is tactical nuke. Or maybe this line is bombs from airplane to the maternity hospital in Warsaw or Poznan. We have to decide at what time we will join this World War III that's already started 2 weeks ago. And on which side? And it's not enough just to say that we are like Churchill. When the war finished, the war
You know, it's not the state of war anymore, it's state of mass murdering. And when it's mass murdering, you have to decide not to just saying that you are Churchill, but being one.
Yeah. Dmitry, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time sharing that with us, and hope that your parents are going to be okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, next, the U.S. says Putin could be on the verge of using chemical weapons. So will he? We're going to talk to a Russian opposition politician who has survived 2 poison attacks. And the powerful images of the children fleeing Ukraine. We have been showing you these now for weeks. These pictures that you look at here were taken by Sarah Seidner. You have seen her with us talking about the crisis there. She are now among the 2.3 million Ukrainians who have already left Ukraine.
It's been a clear evening so far in Sioux Falls, but we are going to be getting a lot colder later on. We'll be falling back to the upper teens by 10 o'clock and midnight, and the wind will start to pick up as well. In Aberdeen, some extra clouds building in for you. You're still at 30 degrees. You'll be quickly falling to around 16 degrees by midnight. And in Pierre, more clouds for you as well. Upper 20s. You'll hold on to right around 20 by 10 o'clock and midnight. And this all sets the stage for even colder temperatures for tomorrow. We'll talk about that coming up.
The continued assault on Ukraine has resulted in numerous sanctions on Russia, throwing their economy in disarray. But what about investments that South Dakota has in the invading country?
But first, lawmakers in Pierre are in their last day of the 2022 legislative session, and left on their plate is still this year's budget. Those stories and more are coming up on Dakota News Now at 6:30.
This is Dakota News Now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Wright.
I'm Andrea Anderson. It is the final day of the regularly scheduled South Dakota legislative session, and lawmakers are looking to finish up on some final details before they head home for the year. But disagreement between the governor's office and some lawmakers has made the final day of the session a little longer than it was intended.
State House reporter Austin Goss is in Pierre and joins us live with the latest on that. Good evening, Austin.
Good evening, Sam. On the last day of the legislative session prior to veto day, state lawmakers are sparring with the governor about what the pathway should look like for future federal dollars coming into the state. The bill, HB 1281, that they're sparring over is intended to create a way for the legislature to vet future federal dollars that would come into the state of South Dakota. The bill effectively makes it so that the Joint Appropriations Committee would have to give approval to new federal dollars being allotted before they went out. The bill is a compromise between the House and the Senate to have more oversight over federal dollars. However, Noem's office argues the bill is a drastic change from the way state government has always worked and would wrongly create a full-time legislature. She took to social media today to rail against the bill.
This creates a whole new budgeting process for the state of South Dakota, which facilitates those grants. The state of South Dakota is the one who makes sure that it's done according to the right federal guidance, that we're not audited and have to pay these grants back. And it is saying that the Appropriations Committee will have to be here full time to approve all of these grants, which there are thousands and thousands of them every single year.
Now, earlier, just a few hours ago, as a matter of fact, the Senate passed that bill by a vote of 32-2 and the House by a similarly wide margin. Now, as for the budget bill, that appears to be close to done and should be closed out here in the next couple hours. Live in Pierre, Austin Goss, Dakota News Now.
Listen, this is corruption. It's not good. And we need to make sure that this Appropriations Committee doesn't break state government in South Dakota.
Governor Noem doubling down on a reported closed-door meeting between embattled Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg and legislative appropriators. Noem posting a YouTube to her social media accounts. One of the subjects involved is Ravnsborg and an additional $1.5 million added to his budget. This comes a day after Department of Public Safety Secretary Craig Price sent out a letter stating that Ravnsborg was unfit to hold the office of Attorney General. Now, regarding the money allocated to the Attorney General's office, Noem is upset that the meeting was not what she considers transparent.
So we don't even know why the Attorney General needs $1.5 million more dollars than what I had recommended into the budget and what the public was able to see and debate. No public hearings, no public testimony. Attorney General doesn't have to say how he's going to spend this $1.5 million.
Turning things over now to a check of the forecast, and still a little chilly out there today.
A little bit chilly, Tyler, but I'm still keeping my eyes out for later on. It looks really nice.
Yeah, you know, we did rebound a little bit today.
They want to attack the rim. They've got some
for black people and for Native Americans living on reservations, they are numerically higher net undercount rates, but the Census Bureau says they're not statistically any different. But still, the bottom line here is that there is this racial gap between people of color, generally speaking, and people who identify as white and not Hispanic. And for what is also interesting is that you do see an overcounting of Asian Americans, which was not seen in 2010. And just to be clear, it's also not clear exactly how well the Census Bureau did in counting Pacific Islanders.
I'm going to play the sound, some of the concerns that we heard from some of these groups today. Listen to some of this.
Some 4 million plus, maybe as many as 5 million, black people have been missed. And perhaps an equal number of people of Hispanic and Latino descent have been missed. Is a tragedy and an act of near malfeasance and incompetence.
Today we learned that this census was really a 5-alarm fire when it comes to Latinos. The undercount of Latinos has tripled between 2010 and 2020. And I think that has significant implications for the entire country.
Not just concern there, you and I were both on the call with the Census Bureau. There seemed to be some anger from some of these groups as well. Can you help us understand, why is this happening? What do we know about why some groups in the official census number just are not counted as they really exist?
This is a long-standing flaw with census numbers going back decades. This trend is not new, and what is new is that in 2020 we had the pandemic, coronavirus, just as counting was getting really started nationwide, the outbreaks were happening, and we had years of interference from former President Donald Trump's administration, beginning most notably with that failed push to add a citizenship question to the forms. It did not end up on the forms, but it stirred up a lot of controversy, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty from a lot of households, especially those with immigrants living in them, of whether or not to participate in the census. And then during counting in 2020, the former President Donald Trump's administration ended counting early. All of these factors raised the risk of undercounting people of color, because research has shown that the way to get those groups counted is through that person-to-person interaction, in-person door knocking, interviews, not necessarily counting on households to fill out a form and to essentially participate in the census on their own. And so that's a really major factors here of why we're seeing a really bad report card in many ways for the Census Bureau.
Racial groups are not, of course, the only demographic. And in this census, this review also found that another group was undercounted significantly, children under the age of 5. We reached out to a children's advocate to talk about what exactly they think that means, their concern there.
Probably the most important reason this matters for young children and for children in general is that there's about $1.5 trillion given out by the federal government to states and localities every year. That's $15 trillion over 10 years that the census data is used, and that buys a lot of things like schools and childcare and playgrounds, things that kids need.
In both of these areas, for kids and also for different racial groups in this country, can you help us understand what's at stake? What does the miscount in the census really mean in real lives?
When we're talking about the census, we are talking about power, we are talking about money. These are the numbers used to reallocate each state's share of congressional seats, electoral college votes. They're being used to redraw voting maps for every level of government across the country. And these are numbers used to help guide the distribution of some $1.5 trillion a year for healthcare, for transportation, for education, almost all public services. And so when there are these racial inequities baked in terms of the accuracy of these counts, you're going to have racial inequities baked into the decision making, into how political power is shared, how federal funding is shared. And, we're not even talking about how researchers, businesses rely on this data to have just a basic general understanding of who is living in the United States of America. And based on these undercount rates and overcount rates that the census put out today, it's another point of evidence here that these numbers aren't true reflections of exactly who is living in the country.
Hansi, in our last 30 seconds or so, what next? Are these numbers final? I know some groups are thinking about court action, but are these numbers final now?
Well, these numbers have already been used to reallocate those congressional seats, electoral college votes. They're already being used to redraw voting maps. The Census Bureau, one of the Census Bureau officials did confirm to me today that the Bureau is looking into possibly doing some more research and how to use these over and undercounting rates and to factor them into upcoming population estimates. And those estimates help guide how that federal funding is distributed. So that could have some potential impact here on maybe a more equitable distribution of federal funding. But it is a real big question of just how a lot of local communities, when they look at their numbers and they feel like they're not quite an accurate reflection of who's living in their communities, it's a big question of what actually can be done beyond waiting for the 2030 census.
Hansi Lo Wang, NPR, and our census guru. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Not that easy sometimes, and to just hear these.
Take a moment to hear from your local PBS station.
Savings of driving an EV.
A lot of those are just in the past couple of weeks. It's clear some in the Biden White House view surging gas prices in recent days as a great reset, a blessing perhaps in disguise. Gas now averages $4.33 a gallon today, maybe as much as $5 soon. And it's a burden for almost every American already hit by high costs and everything else. Climate change advocates hope high gas prices will force us to transition to green energy, take the bus more maybe. In fact, then candidate Biden said almost as much during the 2020 campaign.
No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period.
When you make it hard on the oil industry, the price of gas and oil naturally goes up. The answer from the administration is spend upwards of $60,000 on an electric car. You heard it from Pete Buttigieg. Call it a necessary evil in their view, so we can all save the planet. Retired U.S. Navy Admiral Dennis McGinn, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I guess agrees in some form with that, joins us now. Admiral, did I get everything right?
Not quite, Leland. It's obviously an opportunity to take a political potshot. I'm not accusing you of that, but a lot of folks want to believe that everything that's wrong with the country can be blamed on whatever parties in the White House. From my 35 years in uniform and many years in national security since then, this is a national security issue. I mean, if you want to believe that it's all about greening of America, fine, but it really isn't. Our energy security, our economic security, and our environmental security are all inextricably linked. And whatever we do to reduce our dependence on oil, regardless of where it's from, we got to break the addiction.
So fair enough. In a sense, though, you could break your addiction on foreign oil tomorrow, drill in Alaska and Anwar, you supply the U.S. with oil for 5 years. The problem with, at least in going green, electric vehicle supply chain, 80 to 90% comes from China, both for EVs and their batteries, and then also solar. China's global share of solar cell manufacturing, 80%. That does nothing but enrich dictators.
If we've got the opportunity to accelerate the transition to clean energy, we take on China and their leadership in the green industry. It's not just getting off our addiction to oil, which we are addicted. We've seen this movie before with folks like Venezuela, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and now Russia. We need to be more and more independent of oil. And I'll tell you what, my next automobile is going to be a Ford F-150 Lightning or a Chevy Silverado.
Hey,
both electric trucks.
Good luck getting one, though, these days. There's a long waiting period for them.
Yeah.
To your point, though, and in fairness, NewsNation exclusive polling, is Biden energy policy too focused on climate change? Too focused, 41%, does not focus, 59%. Let me play this out. If the oil and gas industry said, fine, do whatever you want about green energy, but we can give America energy independence until then by drilling more and pumping more oil in this interim, wouldn't America be in a much stronger position to negotiate with Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, China, and Russia if we were at maximum oil output?
Right. I hear what you're saying, but it's not true. It takes a while to gear up.
Right, but they would know we're gearing up. They would know we could become independent.
Yeah, but the problem is there are 3,000 oil and gas drilling permits that are being unused by the oil and gas industry. It's a myth that our oil prices at the pump are caused by any type of government policy.
I hate to correct you. I think it's actually about 9,000.
Okay.
The oil industry will tell you the problem is it's not in the right places, and a lot of those are dry, and we can't drill where we know there's additional oil.
Well, the problem is we need to switch to clean energy, but you just can't do that by throwing a switch. It's going to take a while, but there are things that we can do at the state and at the federal level. And in the
nuclear power
sector,
one of them?
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
Well, that is it. We've got to something that was very different than any of the other climate change folks will come on TV and say, so we appreciate that. Admiral, I apologize. We're going to have to run, but this debate's not going away. We're going to have you back, sir.
You betcha. Look forward to it.
And thank you for all your service. It was incredible. I read some of your bio. Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Jesse Smollett has just been sent.
Play some defense.
I felt that I needed some sort of like concrete industry skill. I came out of Berkeley in like 2008 or 9, moved to New York, super recession times. All the music studios were kind of closing. People were making all these products that you could record at home. So it's just like, oh great. No, they don't need audio engineers anymore.
Audio engineering's loss was composing's gain. Where else would we get a song like Last Night, with lyrics adapted from 13th century Sufi mystic and poet Rumi, put to a beat like this one?
Was even brighter than the sun.
I really liked the idea of juxtaposing Rumi with a reggae groove, but also kind of jazz, upright bass vibes, and then like adding this sort of Urdu meter in the middle.
There's just a whole world of things you just talked about in half a sentence. Let's just go back for a minute.
I was reading a lot of Rumi, I was also listening to a lot of reggae. In a jam, like, those two things kind of came together.
I'm not sure they've ever come together before. It's not like, those Rumi reggae tunes that everyone does.
Right.
Sennecat starts with the natural.
Fox News Network just repeating and pushing out as if it is coming straight from the Kremlin. I wonder, number one, what effect do you think this will ultimately have on Republicans' ultimate support to do what we need to do as a country to support Ukraine? Because I feel like the political incentives ultimately are driven by the far right and by people like Tucker. Right. Do you think that this starts to crack Republican support for Ukraine and for doing things governmentally to support them?
Unfortunately, I do. Look, Liz Cheney described Madison Cawthorn as a member of the pro-Putin wing of the GOP. And she's right about that. There is a pro-Putin wing of the GOP right now, and it has large megaphones. Now, you're going to hear a lot of Republicans, including Lindsey Graham, saying, no, Madison Cawthorn is an outlier. He doesn't speak for the party. But the reality is that Madison Cawthorn is a creation of this new Trumpist Republican Party. They've made him a rock star. And the real problem is the head of the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party is Donald Trump. And I have to say that you listen to this stuff and it sounds crazy, talking about how evil and corrupt.
I think we've lost Charlie's audio. I'm going to go back to you, Mr. Bilkun, because I guess the concern is, Mr. Bilkun, that the United States will not remain united in supporting Ukraine and giving it all that we can. I mean, I realize that the U.S. is reluctant to get involved directly in any hostilities, but are you concerned that the support from the United States will not remain solid if we do have a faction within one of our two major parties that is essentially anti-Ukraine and pro-Kremlin?
No, I wouldn't say I am concerned about the consistency of the support that we are receiving, and for which we thank you very much. And even to a lesser extent, I might fear that this support would be undermined by statements like the one you're discussing. But frankly, yeah. I'm really surprised that this narrative receives so much attention in the U.S. media, because, you know, things like that were said about the world's leaders many times. Suffice it to recall, Winston Churchill was called alcoholic, snake in the grass, and you name it. Charles de Gaulle, the French president, was called a traitor on numerous occasions, but the history dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. So I think that the senator who is now can boast making a new friend like President Putin, because I don't think that any respectable politician will ever want to shake his hand other than Putin, Lukashenko, Assad, and other in this warm company. But I think he's just using every possibility for his publicity. We don't take them seriously, honestly. Most importantly, that President Zelenskyy enjoys the phenomenally high support in the country. The nation is unanimously supporting him, standing with him shoulder to shoulder, as long as he is standing shoulder to shoulder with his nation.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that I wish, and I think Charlie is back, that, Charlie, we didn't have a political party that was essentially controlled by its media wing. If we had a serious Republican Party, we wouldn't even have to talk about this, and we shouldn't have to. But Russia, you know, one of the Kremlin's biggest exports is propaganda, and they've been very effective at breaking our political system in this country. And what I personally worry about, I don't really care about Madison Cawthorn or any of these other fools. What I worry about is that they and that thinking ultimately winds up creeping into the actions of proper Republicans, of serious Republicans who are too afraid to oppose that wing, and that they start to withdraw from Ukraine as well. And I'm glad that Mr. Bilkin isn't worried about it. And you say you are a bit more.
Well, I am, but I mean, it is important to note that it's not happening right now. That really, right now, the pro-Putin wing is very, very isolated, and it is isolated to the entertainment wing of the Republican Party. But as you point out, the entertainment wing of the Republican Party dominates that party, and the head of the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party is Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, and the dominant figure in that party. And don't underestimate how deeply ingrained this anti-Ukraine narrative is in right-wing politics. Remember that Donald Trump and Republicans were obsessed about accusing Ukraine of interference in the 2016 election. They were obsessed with their entire narrative about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and Burisma. So Madison Cawthorn may look like an outlier right now, but again, he is reflecting what was a very standard talking point in Trump world up until very, very recently. So right now, emotions are running high. Republicans are standing firm. But my prediction is that Donald Trump will not be able to resist taking the bait. And once he gets in, you start to see.
We've lost Charlie's. We're going to go ahead and go. But and God forbid he ever get back in the White House again, because you would essentially have him giving Ukraine away. Alexander Bilkin, Charlie SIOUX, thank you both very much. We'll back after this.
Showing appreciation with a perfect promotional item is a...
Tonight, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba posting a disturbing video of sick orphans being evacuated in ambulances from a town north of Kyiv. One of the children clearly unconscious. This is Ukraine's First Lady from an undisclosed location also speaking out, condemning Russia for the refugee crisis. Sunlan Sarfati is out front.
Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenskyi, not mincing words, saying Russia is conducting the mass murder of Ukrainians, giving what she calls her own testimony from Ukraine in a lengthy open letter posted in several languages. When Russia says that it is not waging war against civilians, I call out the names of these murdered children first, Zelenskyi says, addressing some of the youngest victims of the war by name. Since the start of the invasion, the 44-year-old has weaponized her social media, sharing gritty real-time pictures and videos to reflect the reality of the war. This is how Ukraine looks right now, she wrote last week. The whole world, look. Zelenskyy's path to her perch in this global crisis started out reluctantly. I was not too happy when I realized that those were the plans, she has said of her husband running for president, famously first learning of his run on social media. When I asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" he answered, "I forgot." In the 3 years since, she has settled into her role as the First Lady, taking on women's rights and children's issues, and featured in a glossy spread on the cover of Vogue Ukraine. Zelenskyi first met the future president in college, their relationship growing into love years later. Like her husband, she too worked in entertainment as a scriptwriter, writing comedy behind the scenes at the same studio as her husband. I am a non-public person, she has said of herself. I prefer staying backstage. My husband is always on the forefront, while I feel more comfortable in the shade. Their 2 young children, Sasha and Cyril, she is fiercely protective of. The family of 4 now, like so many, at the epicenter of war.
The enemy has marked me as target number 1. My family is target number 2.
The First Lady vowing to remain calm and confident as her own children and so many others are looking to her for strength in this moment. Sunlan Sarfati, CNN, Washington.
And next, a major development on a story we have been following. A powerful day in court as victims of the opioid crisis confront the family who made billions on OxyContin.
Sponsored by Lifescape.
Getting
planning and civilian military reform are critical elements of bolstering partners, allies, and recipient countries around the world, critical to U.S. foreign and security interests, and indeed to the interests of world stability and peace. Indeed, the State Department in this
On point. And his A1C, Ron is on it with the once daily pill Jardiance. Jardiance not only lowers A1C, it goes.
He knows. Table without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, across America, our schools are open and our children are back in the classroom, and that
Intelligence Committee Chairman. These are some scary satellite images. We thought this convoy was wrecked and out of gas, and they had blown tires, and now it's on the move, and it looks like it's threatening to lay siege on the Capitol. Your reaction?
Yeah, they always say that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. And so there was this speculation early on that the Russians would catch up logistically along the way, depending on how much damage the Ukrainians can do. So some of what you see is going into firing positions. Some of it is, guess what? These ambushes on this convoy have taken a toll on the Russians. And so that disbursement is trying to make it harder for those ambushes to have an impact. So I don't see it necessarily as, hey, they're getting ready to come all in. I think they're scrambling circling around trying to figure out how not to have the Ukrainians engage in these ambushes and take a material effect on their effectiveness of these units.
So it's a tactical retreat because they're just getting roasted by these javelins, it looks like, and we've shown footage all throughout the day. Does that make this encirclement less imminent, this redeployment?
No, I think, listen, if you're the commander of the Russians, you're saying, I got to go. I cannot sit here very long or I won't be here, because they're having such an impact on these ambushes. And so I think they really are trying to figure out how they get this thing moving and get it in place. But I think this initial movement looks to me like they're just trying not to get schwacked. They're dispersing their forces. But listen, Putin is going to inflict pain. I don't care how successful the Ukrainians are. We should understand Putin will inflict a lot of pain to get what he wants. This is the beginning stages of that.
All right. Well, sure looks like it. Thank you so much, Mike Rogers, as always. Time for some of your texts. We have Alan from Virginia.
Do you ever experience what we are experiencing right now?
She'd been waiting in line for an hour to try and see if there was some place for her to stay the next few days until the fighting stops. She told us if she didn't get a room after waiting in that line, she had no idea where she was going to sleep. Joy, people are trying to get beds, but there simply are not enough for the number of refugees here. So people are sleeping on train platforms or at makeshift shelters. Joy.
Alice and Barbara, thank you. And a reminder, you can see the masks there. This is all happening during an ongoing pandemic. Double and triple tragedy. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you, Ellis. And that is tonight's readout. All in with Chris Hayes. Starts now.
Tonight on All In.
This is a premeditated and unprovoked aggression built on a body of lies and false narratives.
Civilians under siege in Ukraine.
Any intentional attack on innocent civilians is a violation.
Tonight, new calls for an investigation into Russian war crimes as Putin and his top diplomat try to run the same propaganda play they ran in Syria. Plus, the latest on the ground, Russian tanks now reportedly 10 miles from the capital, Kyiv, and the last American ambassador to Ukraine, who testified at Donald Trump's first impeachment, joins me live in studio tonight. All In starts right now.
Biden official in charge of Ukraine confirmed the story. Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, casually mentioned in a Senate hearing on Tuesday that actually, yes, the Biden administration does fund a series of biolabs in Ukraine, and whatever is in these labs is so dangerous that she is deeply concerned these materials will fall into the hands of the Russian military. Now that struck a...
In prison, felony probation, 150 days in the Cook County Jail, along...
Голова колонны попала в засаду. Командир полка погиб, по остальным разбираюсь.
Сейчас как разберешься, всех соберешь, мне доложишь, как понял.
Оттуда били артиллерия, танки, с беспилотника, так я понял, Байрактар летает. Остальным сейчас потерям разбираюсь.
That video was released by the Ukrainian military defenses showing that Russian column apparently being picked off one by one. Now, we mentioned lies at the top of the broadcast. This one from Russia's foreign minister is staggering.
We do not plan to attack other countries, and we did not attack Ukraine.
We did not attack Ukraine, Sergei Lavrov says, after talks with Ukraine's foreign minister in Turkey earlier today apparently went nowhere. The first part of what he said, of course, remains to be seen.
Shit! Shit, shit, shit.
As for the attacks, you've seen the attacks yourself that have killed 549 civilians, innocent people, according to an estimate released today by the United Nations. That attack you saw there was on civilians who were evacuating from Irpin. 4 were killed in that strike that you are watching right there. You see the people rushing to their bodies. And Mr. Lavrov didn't stop there. He also lied about Russia's attack on that maternity hospital in Mariupol. In so many words, trying to say that the wounded patients being helped by hospital staff through the bombed-out complex did not exist. that the world did not see what it did, in fact, see.
At a meeting of the UN Security Council, our delegation presented facts about this maternity hospital having long been seized by the Azov battalion and other radicals, and they have driven all the pregnant women and all the nurses out of it and set up a base for the ultra-radical Azov battalion.
Now, again, unless the people wounded there belong to the expectant mother's wing, the other members were all dressed as civilians and hospital staff. That is a lie. What is true is that 24 medical facilities have now been attacked since the war began, according to new figures from the World Health Organization. More than 2 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee the country. Another nearly 2 million are internally displaced, many due to the relentless bombardment, which has also produced a moment of remarkable cool under pressure. The video you're about to see is of Ukrainian emergency services team in Chernihiv, gingerly removing the detonator from an unexploded Russian bomb. You hear a bird chirping away in the background. Utter calm and a storm that's only expected to grow. CNN's Clarissa Ward is in Kyiv tonight. Nick Payton-Walsh is in Odessa, and Caitlin Collins is at the White House. First, though, a quick overview from CNN's Oren Lieberman.
Russia's siege on the Ukrainian city of Mariupol is only growing more devastating. Massive craters from Russian attacks. The city digging mass graves for what the deputy mayor says are at least 1,300 civilian deaths. The Red Cross says hundreds of thousands are without food, water, heat, power, and medical care. Russia continues to deny it's shelling civilian infrastructure, like that maternity ward that was hit just yesterday. Local authorities also accused Russia of bombing a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol. The U.S. ambassador to the UN now saying this unequivocally about Russian actions.
They constitute war crimes. They are attacks on civilians that cannot be justified by any in any way whatsoever.
A high-level diplomatic meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine failed to bring results.
I came here with a humanitarian purpose, to walk out from the meeting with the decision to arrange a humanitarian corridor in and from Mariupol. Unfortunately, Minister Lavrov was not in a position to commit himself to it.
The diplomacy has done nothing to stop the war. The Russian foreign minister today even made the extraordinarily false claim that Russia did not attack Ukraine as the invasion enters its third week. Ukraine is claiming a victory in the north. These images show what they say is a defeated Russian tank regiment northeast of the capital Kyiv, but the local government says there is heavy fighting around the city. On the Black Sea, the port city of Odessa is preparing for a fight. The regional military accused a Russian ship of firing in the sky over the city.
I can see what's happening in the country, and I don't want Russian troops to take our city. We are trying hard to set up a force to resist them.
Russia pushing the debunked conspiracy theory that the U.S. is funding bioweapon labs in Ukraine.
This influence campaign is completely consistent with long-standing Russian efforts to accuse the United States of sponsoring bioweapons work in former Soviet Union.
The U.S. and some NATO allies warn that such accusations by the Kremlin may indicate Russia plans on using the weapons themselves.
There is now talk of the use of chemical weapons. We've seen Russia do that before.
Vice President Kamala Harris is now in Poland after the collapse of a potential deal to ship MiG-29 fighter jets through U.S. bases.
Union. The second lie. In fact, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev has acknowledged joint American and Ukrainian research on other pathogens, such as hemorrhagic fever virus. Apparently, there's a lot of this going on in Ukraine, funded by the United States. Did you know that? Why Ukraine? We don't know. We can only guess.
And Robert, on edge for what could be a bloody night.
And that tension has remained in the air here, Marnie. But keep in mind, a lot of the military experts expected Ukraine to fall in 3 days. Here we are on day 15. Many of those experts stand by their prediction that the Russians will ultimately take Kyiv. You talk to Ukrainians here, though, they remain convinced that they will win.
Try telling the Ukrainian people that it is inevitable that their country will be taken by Russian forces.
Сейчас как разберешься.
This column of Russian tanks advanced toward Kyiv, just northeast of the city. The long line of tanks was approaching the capital, but quickly tried to retreat when Ukrainian forces started bombing. The Ukrainians claim a Russian colonel was killed in the attack. This drone video is from the Ukrainian government, but news of the attack has been independently confirmed by the AP.
So a column was moving towards Kiev. The column was big. The ambush was organized. We destroyed the head of the column. Our information is that heading the column, there was a commander of the 6th Tank Regiment, which was destroyed. The soldiers worked the ambush just perfectly.
The fight being waged in Kyiv is similar to what's being seen in the rest of the country. The people, one by one, being turned into soldiers.
For us, this is Judgment Day. It is a struggle between good and evil. And either way, we would die, but we would not let them seize our city.
Nearly 2 million people have left Kyiv. That's half the city's population. And now houses, streets, and buildings are all being reinforced to stand strong against Russian forces. As soldiers fight to hold their ground and defend Kyiv, and some residents flee the impending danger, others try to bring hope to the people. A free open-air concert named Free Sky was held. Of the 70-member orchestra, only 20 gathered to play, but that's all that remains in Kyiv.
This concert is action of peace. More important, this concert, we would like to support our president, Vladimir Zelenskyy.
Even as the sun sets on day 15, the reminders of war are never far away.
And even further, despite the difficulties that many Ukrainians are going through and what we've seen over the past few days, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy remains convinced that Russian President Vladimir Putin will negotiate to end the war soon. Of course, that has yet to happen. Marnie?
Robert Sherman on the ground in Ukraine. Robert, thank you. We'll see you shortly. Maria Shuvalova is a Ukrainian literary scholar and lecturer at the National University in Kyiv, and she has stayed in Ukraine during this invasion. She joins us live once again from outside of the capital city of Kyiv. Maria, always good to see you. I know it's getting more and more dangerous where you are. I know you've been on the move as well. How close is the threat right now?
Thank you for asking me. It is pretty dangerous. Every day we have massive missile attacks and bombarding, and also the nights are severe because starting from 4 a.m. Russians start attacking us more often and more often. And also I'm getting more and more requests to get out of Ukraine and a lot of support. People are offering me new home in Canada. They are ready to pay for all my family in Canada, but we are actually even unable to think about leaving Ukraine right now because Putin terrorized us so much. So we believe that just staying and keep working, keep finding a new job. If you lost your old one, it's very important right now to win.
Wow. It must cross your mind, though, the option to leave.
Yes, I'm offered this help every day for a few times, but it's really impossible to think about that. Also, very talented scholars who are here right now, they have a lot of opportunities to apply and to get good work abroad, to keep building your career. But we are definitely just unable to think. And when we are discussing ability to leave our basement and have a good career abroad, we are talking like that we may able to do that only after victory.
Maria, I understand that you've been told all Ukrainian people are now mobilized. Explain what that means.
each of us doing whatever we can. A lot of people are volunteering because people need medical help, elderly people need help, animals need help, and also we need money so much right now. So if we are able to work, we are working around the clock, getting more and more freelance, because 50% of businesses was closed right now. Not everyone has ability to earn money, but we all the time have a request to buy bulletproof vests for our militaries. So we really need it. And people who are working hard right now and supporting economy, they also are helping us to win this war.
We are hearing that some of the bomb shelters have closed. Are you experiencing that?
Yes, a few bomb shelters in Kyiv, where my friends right now, were closed, but luckily our bomb shelter is pretty fine.
Do you believe that the Russian forces will attack the capital soon as they get closer, that it's imminent?
Yes, a few hours ago, I read official reports that of our government that they might attack. So that's the reason why I'm not sleeping during the night, because I'm responsible for working during the night to earn more money and for waking up everyone when we will hear siren. So we even get official notification about that.
Maria Shuvalova, in a safe place tonight, but you are very close to the danger. I wish you safety, and you're in my thoughts and prayers. We'll be talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Take care. I want to go now to Brian Clark with the Center for Defense Contracts and Technology, specializing in naval operations along with electronic warfare. Brian, I want to thank you once again for talking to us. I mean, hearing Maria, she is in a dark, safe place, hopefully underground right now, as this threat of the Russian forces moves in. I want to share with people at home and also with you, Brian, some video that we saw today. This is a small victory for Ukraine's forces, destroying several Russian tanks outside of Kyiv. They're trying to push into the capital right now. What does this tell you as you watch on the screen about the resistance of the Ukrainians and also their capabilities at this critical moment?
Well, it tells me that they've done a great job of coordinating their operations. They're still able to communicate. They're able to use their radio systems to coordinate an attack, which is interesting because the Russians have a pretty capable electronic warfare system. So they've been able to use their communications despite that. They're well trained. They're able to conduct this ambush, which is a relatively sophisticated operation. And I guess the last thing is they're making good use of the Western weapons that were provided to them, like the Javelin anti-tank missile, which could be really lethal, as you can see in this video, at that kind of short range. The other thing, though, is what's interesting is the Russians are making themselves pretty attractive targets by traveling in these long convoys that signal their advance several hours before they arrive. So the Ukrainian forces are able to position themselves for the ambush and actually coordinate that operation and do it very effectively. So there's effectiveness on the side of the Ukrainians and some vulnerability created by the Russian operations.
Right, it exposes some of their vulnerabilities as they move into the capital. The mayor of Kyiv says the city has become a fortress, essentially protected by armed civilians, and the battle for Kyiv is setting up to be a little bit more lopsided, it appears, than what we saw in Mariupol a couple of days ago.
Yeah, so the Russians are going to concentrate their forces on Kyiv. They want to try to topple the regime. That's obviously their main objective, because they'd like to be able to put their own puppet government into place to then sort of roll up the country writ large. I will say, though, that Mariupol fell pretty quickly. That's largely because it was subject to attacks on both sides. So forces from the east, as you can see on the map there, came from the Donbass, which has been a long contested area that Russians have been occupying. Russians were also able to come from the west, from Crimea, and they also conducted an amphibious landing ashore in that vicinity. So Russian forces were coming from all sides and essentially encircled Mariupol, which is where it stands today, encircled from land and then unable to get out to sea. Whereas Kiev, they're having to approach from multiple land directions, leaving lots of opportunities for Ukrainian forces to attack over the several days it's taking for the Russian forces to arrive in Kyiv.
Brian, we don't want to see this, obviously, but what's preventing the Russian forces from releasing the full brunt of their air force on Kyiv?
So a couple of things, some discussion in the analysis that's been done by some Russia experts shows that maybe the Russian air forces aren't quite as highly trained as they maybe we thought they were. So in particular, one thing that they have not tried to do is close air support. So using fixed wing aircraft to deliver bomb attacks or gun attacks against enemy forces when your own troops are close by. So this is something U.S. Air Force and Marine Corps and Navy aircraft do pretty routinely and did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you have troops in contact, they're in danger, you bring aircraft in to attack the enemy, which helps gives those ground troops an advantage. You don't see the Russians doing that here, and it's because they probably don't have sufficient proficiency to do those really tightly coordinated operations between airplanes and ground forces. The Russian helicopter fleet, which would normally be what you use as helicopters to do this, has been grounded in large part because of the effectiveness of Ukrainian rocket-propelled grenade attacks and air defense attacks. So as a result, the Russians are left with just troops on the ground without a lot of air support.
And running low on patience and probably high on frustrations. Brian Clark, it does feel like this battle is on the brink. We're watching it closely. Thank you, as always, for your insight.
Thanks, Marty.
Coming up next, Putin's biggest fear and what a former Russian spy says about those who stand in his way. Next, in part 2 of an interview you'll only see here on NewsNation Prime. Also saving Putin's nemesis, the unlikely group who foiled at least one of more than a dozen assassination attempts against Ukraine's president. That's next on NewsNation Prime. Also, we are following that breaking news. Jussie Smollett, the actor formerly on the show Empire,
who has never once told the truth on camera. No wonder nobody watches that channel. Joe Kent is a former member of the Army Special Forces.
We cannot prove the things like this because we just don't do it.
You just said you had evidence. What's the evidence?
Whatever we don't do, because Russians just don't do it.
We should note that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov effectively admitted today that Russia did, in fact, possible Mariupol, saying without evidence it was targeted because it contained Ukrainian militants. But this is all familiar propaganda territory. This has been the go-to story Russian propaganda has told about their armies and crimes for nearly a decade now. Sergei Leshchenko is an advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky's chief of staff, as well as a journalist and former member of Ukraine's parliament. Ina Borzilo-Nellis is a co-founder of the Public Journalism Lab, a coalition of journalists and sociologists. She was living and working in Kyiv and has since evacuated to Germany, and they both me now. I know that you've both worked on this exact issue for a while. Ina, let me start with you. It does seem like this counter-narrative really ramped up today. In fact, President Zelenskyy sort of started to talk about it today directly, that the kind of Russian propaganda had word to life. What do you make of that?
Well, unfortunately, Russian propaganda is super efficient and was efficient during the last 20 years. And now we see that this Russian people, Russian population and level of Putin's support is the best evidence. They were brainwashed for decades, and now they do not understand what is white and what is black. And that's why they are not feeling on themselves yet the pressure of sanctions. They understand that maybe it's something temporarily, and we are ready to suffer, but we do support this liberation operation in Ukraine. So we should continue this work. And Russian propaganda, it was like a poison, drop by drop, you know, starting from something small and then 180 degrees the opposite from what is going on, in fact. And the narrative that the West is the biggest danger for Russian values is there. That's why they are covering this war with the lie of a liberation operation, and they appeal to the memory of generations calling neo-Nazis, in fact, which is not true.
Sergei, just mentioned this sort of black is white, up is down. I thought there was a tremendously amazing, stark example of that. Sergei Lavrov talking about no plans to attack other nations, did not attack Ukraine. Take a listen to what he said today.
На другие страны мы нападать не планируем. Мы на Украину не нападали. На Украине мы просто объяснили многократно. Наступила ситуация, которая создает прямые угрозы безопасности Российской Федерации.
We did not attack Ukraine. It's brazen. I don't think it works outside of Russia, but perhaps it works internally.
Yeah, I agree. This is the typical propaganda of Putin regime to say black on white, and what is most to repeat every day on their state propaganda sources, and even today by foreign minister, that they found out some biological weapons laboratorium in Ukraine, and it can predict the purpose for them to bomb Ukraine with a chemical weapon. And biological weapons can be used against Ukraine in this situation. That is why we are so vocal to provide us with jets. I heard the first part of this talk show, and unfortunately, I could not agree with your senator, because we know better what kind of weapons we need here on the ground. I'm in Kiev now, and can say that without jets, without the Soviet jets, which our pilots able to rule, we can lose our skies, and after that, they will destroy our cities like Aleppo. And now, new Aleppo in Ukraine, it's Mariupol. It's totally destroyed now. It's not just the clinic you showing on your video. It's totally destroyed city now, and to stop this, we need to either close our skies, which unfortunately our partners not able to do, or provide just weapons, which our partners ready to do. But what they need to do, they need just to have approval from U.S. Government. And I want to call American citizens to put the pressure on your senators, on your government to provide these jets. We know how to use this jet. And it's not a big problem. Jets are flying. It doesn't take weeks or months. It just takes few hours to deliver jets from Ramstein military base in Germany to Ukraine. We don't need to waste the time, because every day we're losing life of our citizens. Every day we're losing population and buildings and infrastructure. Everything is destroyed now in big cities of Ukraine. If we don't fix this problem, we can lose our country. And believe me, it will not stop Putin from the further escalation, because he has a prescripted plan to destroy Ukraine, to suppress Ukraine, to behead Ukrainian government, and to have Ukraine as a part of Russia. That is why we are calling, and we are calling not the first day, we are calling almost 2 weeks about this. Please let us have these Soviet jets from Poland. But we need approval from American citizens, from American government, and we want to have this from American citizens to put the pressure on American government to provide the jets for Ukraine.
And I know that you are in Germany, and you've managed to make it there safely. So many Ukrainians have fled, 2 million. It's the largest transit of refugees, certainly in Europe, in a very long time, possibly in the world since the Second World War, maybe with the India-Pakistan war in the 70s being exception. I imagine there's an anticipation among people like yourself that there will be millions more every week this continues.
Well, unfortunately, we are not. It's not by our goodwill, you know. People are just fleeing the war, and people from the most destroyed war zones like Kharkiv or Mariupol or Kiev nearby, they're just fleeing the war. And unfortunately, the capacity of western regions of Ukraine is also limited. People just do not. People are already sleeping over there on the floors in churches and in schools, and they're just fleeing somewhere where their kids can be in security. And again, these are mostly, and this is like 95%, are women and kids, because men from 18 to 60 are not allowed during the military times to leave Ukraine. They do protect the country, territorial units, or within our army. So. Yes, I managed to go to Germany before war, because my husband is a diplomat, and we were evacuated according to security protocols, and we didn't believe. We thought it's just the precautions. We thought that nothing will happen, because until the last moment we thought this is a bluff of Russians, like they used to do before. But unfortunately, the war did start, and yes, even from here, I try to help those my friends and those my family who are in need in Ukraine, and trying to navigate them to the safe routes, somewhere where they can hopefully stay maybe for a few weeks. And then all of them are planning, of course, including me, to go back to Ukraine and to go back, to return to our home, to return to our motherland, and to build it again. So please help us to come back home quicker. Just help us with all your support you have, and we do feel it. We do feel American support in sanctions, in weapons. Just help us. Do not weaken this pressure on Russia, and do not weaken the Russian isolation. Please provide us with the weapons so we can defend us and we can defend European and world's freedom and democracy, and just stop this bloody war as soon as possible.
Right eyebrow through his brain.
Right eyebrow.
In one
situation, you showed how bodies aren't even, you can't even do proper burials for bodies at this point in time. And so what they're going to do is starve it until it submits, until the officials there in charge surrender, I assume is their hope. Because, of course, that will then enable them to complete the land bridge from Crimea to the Donbass, the area of southeast. So they will have denied that entire portion of the coast to Ukraine. And so it's really a matter of time, unless the Ukrainians can figure out how to break that siege somehow and get supplies in, restore basic services, and so forth. And I'm sure that that is the issue that is really bedeviling them. And as always, you know, commanders allocate shortages. You never have enough of anything. And so what they may have to do is reallocate some forces from somewhere else where they seem to be doing better than perhaps they'd feared when the plan was developed initially, to try to get down there. Otherwise, at some point in time, that will become the first major city in Ukraine to fall. It will also free up those forces that are encircling it to some degree at least. And that could be a problem elsewhere as well.
General, just one final question. Just from a perspective of a guerrilla fight or insurgent fight, how effective is a Molotov cocktail? Because clearly there are a lot of them around here, and I know they have an accelerant inside to make them stickier. One person here was telling me that against a tank or an armored vehicle, that those are closed systems that do have air intake, and that if you throw it at the air intake, it essentially smokes out the people inside the tank. Is that true?
Well, again, we have some views about the Russian systems that so far aren't proving true. I mean, they're much less well equipped than we believed. And again, to believe that those systems work as advertised probably is worth at least asking about. What you really need to do is get the hatches to pop somehow. And the normal way that that's done, and even our tanks going into Baghdad, they could get swarmed. And if the infantry is not around them to keep the enemy infantry
there is international law around nuclear sites and war, right? I mean, there is an obligation here, for obvious reasons, to allow this the safety issues to be addressed first and foremost.
There are legal requirements here, but there's also just national self-interest.
Yes.
The winds are blowing from west to east. If there is, God forbid, a release of radiation, it's going to blow into Russia. Right. So, you know, not that Vladimir Putin cares about the Russian people, but if he has any, you know, a shred of morality left in him, and if he's worried about what will happen to him personally, being held responsible for what is happening in Ukraine, at the very least, they need to stop operations around this plant. It's just abhorrent in every level that a country that's already suffered the Chernobyl disaster, that's already being inflicted with this invasion, is now going to have to deal with this. And I think you're going to hear calls immediately tomorrow for people to say, well, we have to have a no-fly zone around this area so that people can get in. This is why we're concerned about any conflict in Europe, about any conflict with Russia and the United States or NATO. Things can get out of control quickly, and we have to be very cautious about what's going to happen today, tomorrow, until we can get this conflict to end.
I want to just stress a thing you said at the beginning in case it went by people, because you gave us a lot of information. Obviously, Chernobyl still exists. It was sited in Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union. This is a different plant design. There was a specific kind of defective nature to the plant design there, born in some ways of cost cutting that was part of the long chain of causation that gave the world a nuclear disaster. Just to reiterate, is not that design, and we have every reason to believe the engineering and fail-safes in place are what they should be and far superior to Chernobyl.
It's absolutely correct, Chris. And what we're going to be looking for is there any damage to the plant itself, the actual nuclear components to the plant? If not, then there's no immediate cause for concern. What we will then immediately start to look for is does it have external power? These plants power themselves. The pumps, the cooling systems are their plant. If they fail, then they should have secondary and tertiary power sources, which allow that cooling to take away the heat and make sure that the nuclear reactor and the nuclear fuel doesn't melt. So that's what we're going to be looking for and watching over the next 24 hours.
Okay, John Wolfstall, thank you. Very, very useful. I appreciate it. Up next, the former ambassador to Ukraine who testified in the impeachment trial of President KELO will be here in just a moment.
Allergies don't have to be scary. Spraying Flonase daily stops your body from overreacting to allergens. Also, Flonase.
Life out here goes back to simpler times. To feed and fit your land has been shaped by generations of hardworking hands, raising their herds, watching their families grow. Tractor Supply has been core